Thank you again, everyone, for joining today. We're very excited about our workshop on the Hitchhiker's Coding Clinic. So today we have Victor Dadfar, our lead software engineer on the Hitchhiker's platform. He'll be walking us through the concepts of web development, specifically HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So we have a very action-packed agenda today. We'll go through some quick intros. My name is Sam. I'm a manager on our Hitchhiker's program development team, overseeing a lot of our community initiatives and our events with the overall Hitchhikers user group, our admins and developers. And I'll pass it over to Victor once we go through the quick agenda today, and he can do a quick intro for himself. Victor will be going through an overview of web development, the core concepts of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and then we'll end off the workshop with some additional learning that you can take advantage of, both within the Hitchhikers platform, as well as a couple other areas that we will link out to for self-learning. So today you'll have a takeaway at the end of the workshop. You'll actually have a fully built, simplified version of a Hitchhiker's header, which is super exciting. So you can learn those skills today and then apply them in a live environment through CodePen. At the end of the workshop, we'll also send out a follow-up email with a link to this recording, a link to the slides, and then also some of the hands-on learning that you guys will be doing today through CodePen. So throughout the workshop, I'll be linking out to CodePen for you guys to get a hands-on experience with some of the concepts that Victor will be teaching you with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So we're very excited for this workshop today. Again, very hands-on. Feel free to drop in any questions into the Q&A, and we can go ahead and answer those throughout the workshop. But with that, I will pass it over to Victor, who's the star of the show today, our lead engineer on Hitchhikers. Victor, you can go ahead and intro yourself and then go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Sam. I don't think there's much else to intro for me. You've said it all. I'm the engineer on Hitchhikers. Built the platform, and I've been doing web development for countless years now. So I really hope that by the end of this presentation, you feel more confident and really on your way to becoming a master web developer. So let's get started. Web development, it's not that scary. The concept of web development can be very intimidating. When people hear this term, they instantly think of huge social media platforms like Facebook or e-commerce markets like Amazon. Those are examples of web development, but it doesn't have to be that complicated or that scary. So what exactly is it? A website or web application, as you may be familiar with, presents information and functionality to your target audience in a highly accessible format, your web browser. And web development is the creation and maintenance of a website. It's the product of 3 web-specific languages, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. We'll be going into each of those today. Sites can be as simple as a single-page blog or a huge social media platform like Twitter. So to give a bit of a visual reference, HTML will define the structure of a web page, where elements are, or how they're organized and where they're contained. CSS actually modifies the appearance of elements on a page, and JavaScript gives those elements functionality and brings them to life. HTML, the building block of a web page and the simplest to learn. Hypertext markup language is a series of nested elements that define the content and structure of a web page. These elements are composed of tags that contain content. Tags define what the content is and any attributes that are associated with that content. The content between the tags is what's actually rendered on the page. The tags themselves are invisible. That's a lot of words, so we're going to go into an example to break it down and hopefully make it more understandable. We'll show you some commonly used elements, a short example, attributes that actually modify elements, inspecting HTML, and then a demo and a challenge for you. So here's an example of an HTML element. We have 2 tags, the opening tag on the left and the closing tag on the right. The opening tag is defined by the type which comes first, and then any attributes that come after. The closing tab just has the matching type to the opening tag. You might notice these carets on either side of the tags. That is standard for every HTML tag. Those are what tell the HTML processor when a tag starts and stops, and this / tells it when we have a closing tag. Within the tags is the actual content that's rendered on the page. Like I mentioned, tags are invisible, but the content is not. And then with the attributes, you can modify the elements. So with this specific A type element, that is a link. So on the page, on the rendered page, you will see a learn more link, which when clicked on will bring you to this website. And it will bring you to this website because we define this href attribute, which is required for this A type tag. This tells the A type tag where to link the user once that element is clicked on. Some commonly used elements. We talked about the A tag and its required attribute, the href. And as you saw in the previous example, it can have content in it, which is anything in between the tags. Some other common types are the div tag, which is used for page structure. This has no required attributes, so can stand on its own, and it can have content. You have the p tag, which is used to hold paragraphs. Header tags, which are used to hold headers of various sizes on the page, starting from H1 to H6, with H1 counterintuitively being the largest header and H6 being the smallest. The image tag, which displays images on a page, and the span tag, which is used to emphasize or give special styling to words or phrases. For paragraph, header text, and for p, header, and span tags, they primarily have text as their content. But for the div tag, it can actually store HTML content, and it's highly encouraged that you do so because the page structure of an HTML of a web page is going to be very nested in that there will be elements inside of elements. And so this div tag is great for holding other HTML elements, whereas the p, h, and span tag are great for holding actual text. And then of course the image tag is for images. This is This is a little different than the other tags because it has a source tag, a source attribute and an alt attribute. The source attribute tells the browser where to actually grab the image from, and the alt attribute tells the browser gives the browser some text that appears when you hover over the image. And this is primarily used for accessibility reasons. Because the image tag has these two attributes, it actually does not allow content and actually doesn't have a closing tag. It only has an opening tag. So there is no place to put content in it because it doesn't really make sense for an image tag to have content. It is simply an image. The other elements, except for the A tag, do not have required attributes with them. So here is a more in-depth example, and I'm going to give you like a few seconds to look it over, just dissect it. We have like, in layman's terms, we have a header, we have a paragraph, we have this emphasized text, and an image and a link. So we've represented all of that with the proper HTML tags. And yeah, I think this should be fairly straightforward and understandable. We have, for the most part, text within the paragraph tag, and we have a lot of HTML elements in the div tag. Okay, so another type of attribute that is important for HTML elements are selectors. These can be either the ID, the class, or the HTML name, and these will be useful for when later on in this presentation we learn CSS and JS. They'll be useful for actually grabbing that element to style or to apply functionality to. This is primarily how elements are referenced through their selectors. First up is the ID selector. This is a unique selector that is user defined. All of these selectors are user defined, but the first two are user defined, but the ID is the only one with the stipulation that every selector has to be unique. And so this is great for grabbing a single element. If you want to grab multiple elements, that's when you use the class selector, and that would just be the class keyword instead of the ID keyword. And this is great for grabbing elements of different tag types that require the same styling, such as like a div and a paragraph tag, or subsets of an element tag type that require the same styling, such as a p tag. And then lastly, we have the HTML name, which is inherent. You do not define it yourself. And this is just great for grabbing multiple elements of the same tag type. So in this case, the HTML name here would be div. Okay, so you can actually inspect the HTML of any live web page, anything you can visit in your browser. If you're in Chrome, you can right-click on any element you want to inspect, click on the inspect option, and then it'll bring up the developer tools console. And here you will see in the top right, the actual HTML, the generated HTML structure of the page. So this is really cool if you want to like kind of dig deep into like what makes a web page look that way. Of course, this gets very complicated if you go to a site like Google or Facebook and right click, you're going to see tens of thousands of elements nested with very weird class names and such. So just a bit of a fair warning if you do go ahead. But for simpler websites, typically like personal sites or smaller business sites, this can be very informative for understanding how a site is, how a site's structure looks like behind the scenes. Okay, so here is an example that we're going to show you how to do with HTML. A very simple text block with a buttons module. Here we have three main elements, a header, a description, and a button. And to build this in HTML is quite straightforward. We would use a header tag, a paragraph tag for the actual content or the blurb, and then an A tag for the link with that required href attribute. And we surrounded all this with a div tag to make it easier to reference and to style. And it's always just good practice to surround like self-contained modules this way. Okay, so here's an example that we would like you to kind of think about. You don't necessarily have to write any code. We don't expect you to, but we want to add this announcement bar to the Turtlehead Taco site. It would be a section that looks like the image below with the text, which when clicked on will redirect you to their corporate delivery page. How would you write the HTML for this section? I'm going to give you like 15 to 30 seconds to just think about this, what we've learned up until now. Yeah. All right, hopefully you should have thought about using the A tag, the most important element here, which is what's gonna like allow this banner to be a link that redirects when clicked on. So a potential solution would be something that looks like this, with the A tag, that href attribute that defines the link and the content within it. And then again, we surround it with a div tag because it's good practice as a self-contained module. Okay, so let's look at the header demo. And actually, Sam is going to be sharing this header demo in the Zoom chat, so you can follow along with me. I'm going to give me 1 second to pull it up. So you should be able to see. You should be able to see my CodePen right now. And you can pull that up too for yourself. So if you're not familiar, CodePen is a great little web-based tool that allows you to experiment with HTML creation. It has text editors for HTML, CSS, and JS. Right now, we're only going to focus on the HTML because that's what we've learned so far. So we've pre-written the HTML for this header, and of course, feel free to dissect as I go along with this. And the output is below. It doesn't look great right now. It's simply a few links that they do work when you click on them, but otherwise there's no styling and very little functionality, like a button that doesn't do anything, a white logo that you can't see because of the same colored background. But the HTML should look familiar because it's mostly the elements we had talked about this far with the attributes we had discussed. And so, yeah, I'll give you a few seconds to look through that. If you have any questions, definitely post in the chat and I can answer before moving on to the next section, which will be actually styling the header. Okay, so CSS. That stands for Cascading Style Sheets. That is what actually gives the website styling and appearance. It defines how the elements are displayed on a page, and it's composed of rules that define specific attributes of an HTML element. Hopefully the wording doesn't get too confusing, but when I say attributes here, I am no longer talking about HTML attributes, but just at the general sense of the word. And then these elements can be targeted using selectors, which we've discussed and which will become very useful for styling and for later JS. So a few topics we'll go over. The rule structure of a CSS rule, some basic formatting with color, text, actually styling, an example of styling an HTML element, common selectors, pseudo classes, the box model, which is used for spacing, inspecting CSS, and then a demo and a challenge for you. So the rule structure, it's very straightforward. A CSS rule consists of a property and a value separated by a colon and appended with a semicolon. The property is the actual aspect of the element we are modifying, in this case, the color, and the value is what it's going to be set to. So with this example for color, there are two popular ways to define color in CSS. You can also do keyword selectors like red, blue, or green, but that gives you a very limited set of colors, and you might want to, you're going to want to be able to access more colors. There are millions of them, so why not? You can either define them with a hexadecimal representation on the left or the RGB representation on the right. Both give the same amount of possibilities, tens of millions. I can't do the math right now, but it's about 256 cubed, if you're curious. And with the hexadecimal representation, it's represented a little more different than you might be used to. Each digit is a hexadecimal digit, which means it's one of 16 values. We generally use the decimal representation 0 to 9, but hexadecimal is 0 to 9 and then A, B, C, D, E, F, which gives it 16 possible values. So with each digit being 16, each pair of digits represents a color, one of the primary colors, red, green, or blue, in that order always. And if you do the math, 16 digits in the first and 16 in the second, that would give you 256 possible combinations with each pair, which is the same amount of possibilities you get with each RGB digit. The only difference is that RGB starts at 0 instead of 1, so you end at 255. And like I mentioned, you use each pair, either pair of digits on the left or each digit on the right reference as one primary color. And this way you can make millions of different possible color combinations that way. Text formatting, very straightforward. The rules are pretty self-explanatory. You have font family, which defines font size, weight, which defines the thickness or the thinness of a font, the spacing between each letter, the actual color, which we went over, and the text transform, which can be lower or uppercase. Sorry, it can be lower, uppercase, or capital case. And these are just a small subset of all the rules available. There are hundreds of CSS rules. And of course, we don't have the time to go through them today, but we want to give you an idea for the most common and popular ones that you might use. But we do encourage you to, of course, if you are interested, to go through and seek out more rules, because there are hundreds of ways to style an element and make it look unique. Moving on from text, we have general formatting. Some popular rules are opacity, background color, and the text align, which tells you how the text is horizontally aligned in its container. So with actually styling an HTML element, you need to be able to reference it or select it. And that's where the selectors I mentioned earlier come in. In CSS selectors, oh, my bad. Sorry, CSS selectors are prepended with a special character, which tells you the type of selector you're referencing. In this case, the class selector uses the period character that prepends the actual class name. So with this example, period learn-more, you are going to reference any elements with the class learn-more. And that can be multiple elements, because class names are not tied to one specific element or need to be unique. Within the two brackets following that selector are all the rules that would be applied to that selector. So here we're going to apply color, background color, and a host of font and text rules. Same structure as earlier. Some common selectors, the ID selector, which uses a pound symbol. That's great for targeting a single element with the ID tag. The class selector, we just talked about this, uses a period character. The HTML name has no character in front of it. And pseudo classes. This is for targeting specific states of an element, such as the hover state, which occurs when your mouse cursor is on top of an element. And you can actually change the style of the element depending on how it interacts with how the user interacts with it, without any JavaScript, which is pretty neat. Some common pseudo classes are the hover state, the focus state, the active, and visited. The hover state is when you hover over an element. Oh, and these pseudo classes, by the way, always require that colon between the selector and the hover and the actual pseudo class name. In this case, we're using an HTML name, but you can just as easily use a class name followed by a colon and then the state name or an ID. So the focus state, that is the state that is triggered when you actually tab on an element. When visiting a page, there are certain elements that are open to being selected by tabbing, and that's more for accessibility reasons, and you might be familiar with it from seeing like a blue outline on an element. But when that happens, you are triggering the focus state of that element, typically used for input elements on a form. The active state is going to be when an element is currently being clicked on, not when it has been clicked on, but when it is currently being clicked on. And these definitions change slightly on desktop or mobile. It's not too important for you right now. We're just kind of I'm teaching all this with the context that we're doing it on desktop, but just for your information. And then the visited state is going to be the state after an element was clicked on, so past tense. Both of these are typically used for links and buttons. Focus is used for input elements, and the hover state can be used on any element. Okay, so an example of a pseudo state. Talked a lot about it. Hopefully this example helps. We define the hover state to change the cursor to a pointer style and the color to red, and this example is doing exactly that. Some more states. The focus state with that light blue outline. It's hard to visually demonstrate a tab, but just pretend that I'm tabbing. And here we are giving it an outline width of 2 on tab, which is why you see that light blue outline. The hover state changes and this is, the default state. The hover state changes the element's color to red. The active state would change the weight to bold. And the visited state in this example is changing the color of the link to purple. And notice how the link is no longer bold because the active state has ended once the click has ended. Okay, so spacing. CSS uses the box model for spacing, which involves 3 properties: padding, border, and margin. Padding and margin are always invisible. Border has the option to be invisible, but is typically used to apply like stylized borders to elements. It would be pretty rare to see it used for anything else. This visual should help to give you an idea of the positioning of these 3 properties. The padding is always going to be directly surrounding an element. The border will come after, and the margin comes after that. The order of this never changes. So why would you use these 3 models, any of these properties? Padding is used, or sorry, I'll start with the most obvious, which is the border. That's used when you want to add a border to an element. When you want to add space between the element and the element's border, you would use padding. When you want to increase space between the element and neighbor elements, sorry, the border and neighbor elements, you would use margin. If you are not using a border, it would seem like you could use margin or padding interchangeably, but that actually isn't true. The element's size is affected both by its border and padding, but not by the margin. So that just means like the element essentially ends where the border ends, according to HTML and JavaScript. They do not care about the margin when calculating the size of an element. So something small but important to keep in mind as you decide which you want to target. Okay, so inspecting the CSS of a web page, that's very similar to inspecting the HTML. It actually comes up on the same prompt or same developer tools console, just at the bottom right instead of the top. And this will show you the rules applied to each class. It gives you a nice little box model visual with the size of the elements. And in the kind of the bottom right, it's cut off, but it would give you an absolute list of all styles applied to that element, both like by default and actually applied by the user. Okay, so another demo. We have this text block with buttons module, and we want to make it look a little more presentable. In this example, we're only going to focus on the button of this module. So seeing the first slide, you have, of course, the default HTML, the generated HTML, and when properly styled, it should look like this. So knowing that, let's take a look at how we actually achieve that before to after look. So on the left, we have the HTML for the link. Of course, it has a required href attribute. It also has this target attribute and the class attribute, which we went over. And on the right, we have the actual CSS to make it look the way it does. Now, you're going to notice that the rules are separated into different classes, which seems odd because we are styling a single element. Why not put them all under one selector? And that's just because it's good practice to kind of separate out the rules that you know will be reused elsewhere. So you might have another button on the page that needs to use the same styling. So you separate out that button class so you can apply it to other elements. Same goes for primary buttons, which are a subset, and large buttons, which are also a subset. And of course, you may not want that underline to appear on any links on the page. So you just apply the text decoration none, which removes the underline to every A tag. But these rules should be familiar to you. We have the color and the background color, padding for the spacing, and then increasing the font size. Okay, a challenge for you. A similar banner to before, but now Turtlehead Tacos wants to modify the styling to be more in line with their corporate branding. They also want the banner to turn dark orange on hover. How would you style this section? I'm going to give you 10 to 15 seconds to think about what rules you might use, what pseudo states. Keep in mind that This banner actually does have a border around it. It is hard to tell, but it is there. Okay, so the solution. We went with, if your solution included changing the background color and using a pseudo state, then you're definitely on the right track, because that is the most straightforward way to get the desired result. This is an orange color and this is a darker orange color. You wouldn't immediately notice because it's an hexadecimal, but for context, we've also added a border to the entire div, and it's also not really important what selectors you might have thought of because you didn't know what selectors were being used in the HTML. And we've used some rules for increasing the padding, the size, and the weight of the actual text. Okay, so back to that header demo, which again, Sam will share the that link in the chat, which you can follow along with. And I'm pulling that up. Hopefully you can see my code pen. And yeah, similar to before, we have the same exact HTML. And then in the middle, we have the CSS, again, pre-written for your convenience. Feel free to dissect it. We do use a pseudo state for the links. We remove the text decoration, but otherwise, most of the same properties we've shown off so far. And you can see the header on the bottom. It looks far more professional and something you'd see on the expect to see on the Hitchhiker's site. The links do change styling on hover, which is great. However, that button still doesn't do anything, and that is something we will remedy with JS in a bit. And you can now see the header, the logo, because of the contrasting background. So hopefully, going from just HTML, which I don't know if this live previews, yeah, going from just HTML, which I guess this won't, but going from just HTML to CSS will change how drastically change, I guess, how the elements look like, and it really goes a long way to improving the look. Okay, so moving on to the final section of our presentation, which is the JS. That stands for JavaScript. And that's what actually brings that functionality, that dynamism and action to your web page. Can react to user input and modify the HTML of a CSS. Modify the HTML and CSS of a web page. And it also allows for much more complicated functionality, such as sending and receiving API requests. Without it, we would have static pages, but with it, we can create high-powered web applications. And keep in mind, JavaScript is a fully fledged programming language. And to be able to teach it thoroughly would require an entire class, not just a part of a webinar. So we are going to do our best to just teach you the absolute minimum, or kind of the basics of it that will get you started. And hopefully that is something that you follow through on and continue to learn on your own, because it is very powerful and you can really bring a website to life with JS. So what we're going to go over today are variables. We'll introduce the concept of variables, JS types, printing, basic usage, and the query selector. Okay, so a variable, it's a way of holding data or information. An example of this is if we want to store the website user's name, maybe to keep track of who has visited our site. So in that example, we would have a variable name defined on the left, an equal sign, and the actual variable value defined on the right. the name on the left is what JavaScript, what you would use moving forward to reference this variable. You would just use that letter X. And whenever you use it, it would have the value of Victor until, of course, you changed its value. And this equal sign is not bidirectional. The assignee always needs to be on the left and the value always needs to be on the right. If you swap the two, that would give you an error. It's another example with another variable set to Sam. Okay, so some basic types. You have the Boolean, which is a type of variable that can either be only true or false. You have the string, which is a series of characters written in quotes. In this example, both of these were strings. And then you have a number, which those are just numbers. Okay, so printing in JS can be achieved using the function console.log. Without getting too deep into functions, they are essentially these like processes where you would give it an input and they would either perform an action and then possibly optionally give you an output. So with the console.log function, you would give it the input of the thing you want to print out to the console, and then it would actually go ahead and do the action of printing it to the console or outputting it. So in these three examples, we're giving it a Boolean value of true, we're giving it a string value of hello, and we're giving it a number value of 42. Notice how I said value and not variable, because none of these are variables. They are simply values that could be assigned to variables, but are right now just values. If we had taken this previous example and said console.log and then X, just X without the quotations or anything, it would actually print out the value of X, which would be Victor. But here, these are just values. And printing, of course, can be very helpful for debugging. And if you're not familiar with the console, that's just, that appears in a browser's developer tools you saw earlier with the inspect element. So you would never actually see that on the web page, or the user would never see that unless they open up developer tools, then they could see the console outputting anything from the JS. Okay, so some more basic usage. We have defined variables as numbers. We're adding them and then we're sending them to console.log. And this syntax, by the way, the function name and then the parentheses with the input in between, that is consistent amongst all JS functions. And actually having that semicolon at the end of every line is required for the language. Another example, this time we have variables of the string type, but with the same add operand. So JavaScript is a bit nimble in the way that it performs operations based on context, so it won't always perform them the same way. It looks at what the variable types are it's performing the operations on, and then changes depending on that context. So with numbers, it will do the most straightforward thing, which is add them together through arithmetic. With strings, of course, there is no conceptual way to add two strings together in the same way you can add two numbers. Rather, JavaScript actually would combine them together. So the output would just be one big string with the two pieces. Okay, document.querySelector. This is going to be very similar to CSS selectors. We have some basic HTML with a class selector attribute. And our web page would look like the content of that element, which is just hello world. Now, if we want to change the text of this element, but we can only do so after a user has clicked on the button, we can actually do that with JS. Earlier, I mentioned CSS pseudostates, and those are great for changing an element's styling on interaction, but it's limited in two ways. One, a CSS pseudostate can only be applied to the element that the interaction is focusing on. So if one element is being covered on, you cannot use that to change the styling of another element. Two, you cannot use it to change anything other than the styling of an element. In this example, we're changing the actual content, the actual text of this element, which we would never be able to do with CSS. those two limitations are generally when you would fall back on JavaScript for that interactivity. So we can actually use query selector to first grab that element using the same period selector that CSS used. If you remembered, we called it my class. And then again, this is the name of the function, document.querySelector. We have the input as a string between parentheses, and the output of that, which is being set to this element, this variable, my element, is going to be the actual HTML element with that class. Yeah. So now that we have that element in that HTML element in a JS variable, we can use the inner HTML property to actually change the text of that HTML element. And that would be the output. Now let's put it all together and revisit that header demo one last time, which again will be shared in the chat. Okay, so you should see my screen, my code pad one more time. And now we've added some JS to our header, which will give it that functionality. So we have the query selector for the My button, selector, which if we revisit our HTML is given to this element. So we know that we know that this selector with that class character is going to be referencing this HTML element using that document.querySelector function, and it's set to that JS variable. Now that JS variable, we are going to add an event listener. It's not too important to know what it is right now. That is essentially a function that, similar to CSS pseudostates, will activate when a certain action is performed on the target element, which is my button element. Well, sorry, on the target variable, which represents the HTML element. It's a bit convoluted, but you can essentially treat that as an HTML element. The actual action we're targeting is going to be the click action, which we give as its first input. And then the second input is basically another action to open up a window alert pop-up with this text. So hopefully seeing it in action will make more sense. I click on it and I get that alert, which means it works as intended. So that would conclude our HTML, our header demo. I hope that helped you understand the anatomy of a header and really get you started on your journey in web development and help you feel more confident in HTML, CSS, and JS. And yeah, I'll give you a chance to play around and definitely ask any questions.
Thanks, Victor. And this is Sam here. We did get one question from the chat, and it was regarding the URL link once a user clicks on learn. And the user was wondering if why can't we use HTML to add the URL link once we click on learn, and why would we use JS? I think, Victor, this may have been some confusion on their side because we are adding the link with HTML, correct?
We are, yes. So the entire functionality of that learn link right now is controlled through the HTML. This is not currently working, but if it was, it would have linked me to hitchhikersthehex.com. And yeah, we're not using any JS. Like I could remove this. In fact, I think I still have this HTML only example. When clicking on the learn link, it does redirect you. So perfect. No JS required there.
Great. Well, I think that was all we had from the attendees in terms of questions. We'll keep an eye on that for our closing remarks here. Victor, if you wanted to jump back into the slides, I'll just do a quick quick closeout on some takeaways for today. So obviously you guys learned a lot about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript through Victor. I hope you all feel confident in those skills now and feel like you can start taking the next step in your journey into becoming an HTML, CSS, and JavaScript expert. With that said, if you want to learn more, we have tons of really interesting modules and training units on the Hitchhiker site. So we do have full units and modules dedicated to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So you can go in there and learn more. A lot of the topics will cover what Victor showed you today. So you can go back and relearn some of that content, as well as test your knowledge through some of the quizzes and module assessments that we have on the site. So we will send this deck as a follow-up so you can link out to these units, test your knowledge through Hitchhikers, and then also you will have some resources linked in those units to some external sources that we also pointed to today a bit throughout the slides. The next slide that we have, and this is just a closing, is that we did want to link to some other resources on the internet. So definitely recommend checking these out if you want to learn a bit more about the concepts and some more advanced topics of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, overall the different frameworks and how they fit together in the overall design of web development. So again, we will send the links out today for everyone that attended to the slides. We'll also send out a recording as well as an overall recap of today. But wanted to thank everyone for joining the workshop. I hope you all learned a bit and feel confident in becoming a web developer. So thank you again for joining, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your Thursday. And special thank you to Victor, our lead engineer, who walked us through these concepts today. So thanks so much, Victor.
Thank you. Yeah, and I hope you all learned a lot today.
All right, see you next time. Thank you.